Hello, and welcome to Passing the Mic, a series of conversations that will explore the issues that matter most to school leaders, teachers, students, and parents. I'm Sashelle Harris. Without a doubt, 2020 was a year we'll never forget. From the death of Kobe Bryant to the murder of George Floyd, our nation saw a painful new reckoning with the centuries old legacy of racism and oppression. 2021 has had a few dark moments too, from the insurrection at the Capitol to the increase of hate crimes against Asian Americans. But there are a few bright spots. In this previously recorded conversation, our CEO Dan Weisberg sits down with Georgia's Principal of the Year, Keith Ball, to discuss how he is using the power of the JEDI to dig deep, ask the hard questions, and do the work to create a safe haven and sanctuary for students in a season filled with trauma. We hope you enjoyed this conversation. Dan, take it away.
Hey, good morning, Keith. So happy you could be with us. There's so many questions I have for you about the work you're doing at Marietta High School. But I want to ask you, we're sitting here the morning of January 26th. That's a special day. Can you talk about the meaning of that day to you and the community at Marietta High School?
Yes, thanks, Dan, for having me and wanting to participate in this very important, hopefully national dialogue, but something that's near and dear to us at Marietta. So today, which happens to be January 26th, the 1-year anniversary of the passing of Kobe Bryant and his daughter, was also the first day we met to embark in earnest on our JEDI journey. And JEDI meaning, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we were sitting in a room when we were allowed to be face to face, which we all obviously miss, with members of our central office, members of my school-based staff, and then also Clearwater, a third-party consulting group that we had spent the fall of 2019 vetting and hiring. And we really started our conversation talking about how generationally, for 20 years of Kobe Bryant playing in the NBA and being basically the person that carried Michael Jordan's torch and all the things that were passed on, what this sudden death would feel like to our kids and our staff members and people that wore his jersey and wore his sneakers and drank Sprite and had a McDonald's French fry because of him. And it was a sad day. However, it was a little bit easier to segue into the bigger issues that we had to confront, albeit we didn't know we would go from Kobe's death to Ahmaud Arbery to Breonna Taylor to George Floyd, and basically, the world, or at least our little world in the United States, coming to a reckoning. But yeah, it was on this day, sitting in a conference room, where we began this very important journey.
So let me take you back, Keith. Tell us a bit about your community and about your school and the 2,600 or so young people you're responsible for.
Yeah, we have an awesome student body. Marietta High School has been around for 128 years, which obviously has a tremendous amount of history embedded inside of that, both good and something that needs to be addressed and understood when it comes to segregation and racism. We're a double majority minority school. 37 or so percent of my students identify as African American or Black. About another 37% of my students identify as Hispanic or Latinx. We only have about 16% of our students who identify as white, non-Hispanic. And then the balance of that math is primarily identifies as multiracial. So we are very diverse, but obviously as a white male and as a principal, that is something that needs to be addressed as well. It also needs to be addressed that there is a privilege that I have that I obviously bring both historically and in terms of my leadership role that I need to check and recognize if I'm going to do a good job of leading not just a group of young men and women or students that don't identify as a race or a particular sex or gender, but also my staff, which primarily is between 40 and 45% minority. So it's still a majority white staff or non-Hispanic staff. The community, however, is a little bit different. The city that we are in, which is our own little happy school district within this monster county school district of Cobb County, is primarily white. And they're white, retired, close knit. A lot of them are generational Marietta families, 3-4 generational Marietta families. So that's interesting dynamic, both in terms of housing, in terms of who actually sends their kiddos to school, versus who is walking or driving or shopping in a pretty awesome, very, very unique southern city in Marietta, Georgia, about 11 miles outside of Atlanta proper.
Yeah, and what your families, where do they work? How they, are your families unlike the surrounding community? Have they been in Marietta for generations? What's the family situation like?
So it's very interesting. The city has 8 different elementary schools, if you will, that are obviously zoned typically like anywhere else in the country. All by zip code, all in a geographical region that really is dictated by transportation. The ability to have kids get on a bus and go to their elementary school, and then obviously everybody's going to filter up to the high school. What's interesting, and one of probably the most important things I did and still do, is I traveled to every elementary school on a bus with a group of my kids to visit future Blue Devils. And that bus ride is very, very different depending on the elementary school you go to. So if you go to Dunleith Elementary, which is about 90% Black and African American students, I'm not exactly sure what their staff makeup is. And then you can go to Westside Elementary, which is about 90% white, and also a very dominant white staff. And then there's a mixture of kind of schools in between. I would say those are the two kind of polar opposites geographically and the makeup of families and housing that are there. The West Side families primarily live in very, very nice single family homes. Some of them are brand new homes that were, knocked down or were vacant property, X number of years ago, or live in what's called old Marietta houses that were built around the turn of the century, 19th century, 1910, 1920. Beautiful, beautiful homes that go right into mainstay downtown Marietta and a beautiful hospital facility. And then in Dunleith, it's primarily older homes built in the 60s, kind of ranch style homes. And then there's a ton of apartment complexes that live there as well, which, naturally has a little bit of a transiency population. But there are families that have been there for a while as well. But at the end of the day, they all come to Marietta, and they all come to Marietta High School, and they all become a Blue Devil, and hopefully all get a Blue Devil diploma.
So thanks for that background, Keith. So I think fall of 2018, you as the school leader assemble a coalition of stakeholders in the community and decide to take on what is the most difficult issue, I think, anywhere in the United States, and that's the issue of race and racism. Before you get into that process, I would love to hear you talk about it. I would love to just ask you, Keith, about your story. How did you, as a white man from the Northeast,
Yeah.
decide that you were going to take this on? I don't think this was a mandate from the district office. This was something you decided to do with the support of your superintendent, but you decided to take this on. But tell me a little bit about your story. Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school? What's your history as an educator? And how did you get to this point where you decided you were going to take on this very difficult, challenging issue, which I'm sure involved a lot of risks?
Well, you're right, Dan. I think it's very important to know that this was not a professional mandate. This was a personal decision based on need. And my background in growing up, I think, has a tremendous amount of influence in making that decision. I will not claim that the absence of fear and worry were not present in 18 or present now. Again, I have to recognize and remember who I am and my privilege and being a white male as the principal, and not looking on the outside like my kids, but however, where I grew up, I had a similar experience in terms of not being part of the majority class. Where I grew up, you were pretty much either Black, African American, or Jewish, and I'm neither of those. Where I grew up has the second largest Haitian population in the country, minus Miami, second to Miami. And being in a football locker room and being a short white kid, and just trying to do your best to fit in and trying to find a way to be accepted is a challenge for any teenager, regardless of how you identify, by race or by gender or by sex or religion or culture. But I understand at least the hurdle of not being part of a majority class when you're sitting in a classroom or in a locker room or on a playing field. I'm very thankful for the friends that accepted me for who I am and for what I wasn't, for inviting me to their table to either have Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah or Hanukkah or a Kwanzaa event or any type of event that I was completely foreign to, whether I was sitting in a temple, sitting in a mosque, or sitting in a church. Also, as a student of history, I appreciated it, and that's what I studied in school because I felt like that is how I can learn and be better as a person, not only for my culture, but for the people that I would come into contact with. But I think that prepared me, and I think the household I grew up in, where my parents and my family talked more about love than and acceptance than the color of somebody's skin or the God that they pray to. I dated all sorts of people growing up, whether they were Filipino, Hispanic, Black, mixed. My parents, welcomed them into our home and never made it an issue. And I'm extremely thankful for that. And you also can't do that on purpose. I just happened to be born where I was born, happened to have win the lotto with my parents. In terms of who they were also working class people. So we didn't have money. My dad was a parking garage manager and my mom was a secretary. So we didn't have the issue of understanding what it was like to have money and then hang out with people who didn't. I think it made it a lot easier sometimes not having a tremendous amount of financial means because it didn't make me feel even more uncomfortable where I was. So I'm very thankful for that. And it really was the precursor and predicate to me going into this and coming to a school that was very similar to where I grew up and feeling that there was a disconnect and a conversation that needed to occur. And I really want to thank my college advisor, Brandy Smith. She came in my office. She's an African-American female and said, what are we going to do about this undertone? And how are we going to address the fact that, you're the fourth principal in 5 years, and they tried to have a female African-American principal, and it only lasted 1 year, but there's still residual issues with that. And now there's another white guy in charge. Are we going to address these things, or are we just going to continue this 120-year history of not paying attention to it? I said, no, I feel it as well, which means the kids feel it, which means we need to do the right thing. And if we're going to know better, we need to address it ourselves and take this on as a personal mission, and then figure out if we can get 230 staff members to jump on board. So that was the genesis of it.
Yeah, appreciate that. Appreciate you sharing all of that, Keith. And sounds like you definitely did hit the lotto, and in a lot of ways. And it's a blessing to have parents like that and grow up in a diverse community, and get all the benefits that you can get from being in a diverse community. So your college counselor, calls this out and asks you what you're going to do about it. But talk about what the it is. So when you walk in as principal, let me ask you, how long have you been principal at this point?
This is my third year at Marietta High School, 13 years as a principal overall.
Right. So there's this tension, but talk a little before you embark on this work. How is that? How does it manifest? What are you seeing? What are you feeling? What are you hearing from the kids that causes you to think, yeah, there's some unresolved issues here that we really got to delve into?
Right out of the gate, it was conversations that I either witnessed or kids reported to me that were not to say they were not positive. I don't think that's the best way to frame it. They were not productive. They either had a twinge of bias, conscious or unconscious. There was sparks of white privilege. There were issues of creating or perpetuating a lack of desire to really address a broader issue. So like dress code, how a kid looks, how they present themselves. Also, in our school, 1 out of 2 kids are food insecure. We're a Title I school. If a kid who shows up on a freezing cold day and is wearing a quote unquote inappropriate outfit on that day, do you really think they wanted to walk outside and freeze, or was that their accessibility to that outfit for that day, where they don't have the means to do that? And how was that addressed by a staff member? Was it addressed coming from a place of, let's have a conversation, let's see where I can help, or I'm going to march you up to the main office, you don't have the right outfit on, and we're going to ding you with a dress code violation? So something as what appears to be mundane, which was not, however, more very intimate conversations about or ignoring race or ignoring cultural, or really being culturally responsive. I mean, we looked at our textbooks, we looked at our novels. If you really want to know what's going on in a school in their classroom, look at their novel library. What is being taught? Is it culturally responsive? Are our kiddos looking at somebody that is telling all of the story, or at best some positive stories about who they are? Or is it all just the same authors telling the same story that is not addressing the other issues that our kids really, in a free and public education, have a right to know? Not just a kid of color, but every kiddo. And all of that was present. And we needed to address our response, our cultural responsiveness to that. And it started by writing our mission statement, our beliefs and our values as a school that we did not have as a 125-year-old school, which I did not understand coming in as the principal. But we needed to start there, and everybody had a say in what those were. And then we basically used that as our North Star to move forward to tackle this tough work.
So take us through that. Fall of 2018, you begin this process. In a lot of schools, I think if you're going to take on issues that involve curriculum and instruction, which they do, and relationship between staff members and staff and students, what you'd probably do traditionally is get some teachers together, get some administrators together, maybe a district person, maybe a consultant, and kind of sit in a room and decide what's best. You didn't go that way. right from the start. You had a much, much bigger tent. So tell us about that tent that you created, that coalition that you created to start this work, and talk about your decision-making process to go much broader than is typically done in schools.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. I don't know if it was Muhammad Ali or Mike Tyson who said, everyone's got a game plan until you get punched in the mouth. It definitely was a boxer, but I I may be wrong who said it. We went in from fall of 18 into early 19, January and February, with a pretty good plan of ripping this Band-Aid off. I wouldn't even say peeling the layers of an onion. And we were going to address personnel. And are we doing everything we can to make sure we are attracting and retaining a teaching and staff population that is reflective of our students. Let's go into our instructional materials and let's start tearing that apart. Let's make sure as we're doing this, we're framing it and using our mission and values and commitments as a guiding light. Let's talk to kids and figure out where the blind spots are, where the biases are. Let's look at our discipline record and our discipline policies and processes. So we start plugging along there. We go through DISC assessment. So we start with an inward look instead of an outward look. Instead of this being, maybe a week-long venture or a month-long adventure, we signed on with this third-party consulting firm for a year. Knowing that, again, in a year we weren't going to be done, but our goal was to be self-sustainable and not be reliant on an outside group to do this. So we had a mission to get that done. And we're plugging along, and I think addressing this as best as we possibly can. And man, it was awkward and uncomfortable and at times contentious. So this wasn't a hold hands, skip down the road together of peace, love, and harmony. We got after each other. I know I got defensive. I know other people got offended and defensive. So by no means was it easy. Then the spring comes, we go on COVID lockdown. And did I wake up in the morning and go, do we need to put this thing on pause because now we're dealing with a pandemic? Of course I did. But whether it was the core group of folks that I worked with, college advisor, two of my assistant principals, members of my team, the consulting group, we decided to stay the course and just switch everything virtual, which was a little bit, of a change. We weren't prepared for that like the rest of the planet, but we stayed the course. Thank God we did. And then the spring hit in April and May and June, which we were not, obviously not prepared for, or we didn't think we were prepared for. And all of our focus and all of our work while we were dealing with one pandemic, we are now going to deal with an epidemic of racism that is now no longer done in a meeting room and trying to address things in a orderly way, in a scientific way, if you will, in a way that, yes, was uncomfortable and yes, at times defensive and offensive, but way out in the open and on public display and constantly on the news and dealing with life and death, not just was this book okay? And did I say the right thing in addressing a student who maybe wasn't dressed the way I thought they were, or I was being culturally insensitive? This was escalated to a point where the oxygen was sucked out of the room, literally and figuratively. And that needed to be addressed in a way that was not systematic and methodical. It was immediate, and we had to sort through the emotions before we can get back to the surgical steps we wanted to take to do it. And it was tough. But here was the blessing. And again, thank God, you look back sometimes at an earlier version of yourself, professionally or personally, and you're like, man, was I a knucklehead and I didn't handle that the right way? And sometimes you look back, and I do it through the lens of luck and go, thank God, or my lucky stars that we said yes to X, Y, and Z. So we took JEDI and what we were working on with justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion and said, we have a trauma issue. So we need to address trauma immediately. Our own trauma, the trauma in our community, the trauma that's unfolding nationally. So we built and combined our JEDI work with our Student Life Center that already was working on trauma since about 2015 or so. And we said, we need to build a new program, new internal capacity to address the dual issue of trauma that we're going through, both in terms of COVID and race and death and a loss of time with each other, with lives that are being lost due to COVID and due to racism, and combine the two. So we built that over the summer with the goal of launching it in July when my staff came back in preparation for my students to come back. And that was a summer, my friend, of a ton of work and really trying to make it through this. Like you said, there's not a playbook for this. There's 22,000 high schools in the United States, and I couldn't necessarily find one that was combining this relationship. Some were doing well in one, some were doing well in the other, some were dabbling in it, some were not paying attention to it at all. So we built it and rolled it out, and ever since July, on Friday mornings at 8 o'clock, we dive into trauma sensitive, which we took from the research done in Wisconsin. It was done on a public platform with a private partnership. And we went through Red Cross American Psychological First Aid training. We went through, again, DISC. We went through IDI. We went through every other, index we could possibly go through. We went through a bias cleanse that actually was promoted by MTV, believe it or not. I didn't even know MTV was still around, to be honest with you. I just heard Mark Goodman on Sirius XM, but I didn't know MTV was like still a thing. I don't have cable, so for as much as I think I'm hip and in tune, I had no idea MTV was still around. So we tried everything to build this together, and I want to really thank Dr. Roberts, who runs my Student Life Center, her facilitators. And we built out JEDI groups, and I think it's so much fun. As much of all the tough things we went through, we named them after Jedis. We named them Leia and Yoda and Luke Skywalker and Chewbacca, and we tried to bring some maybe disconnect and a little bit of nonfiction to the fiction we had to confront. And it didn't start out well. Again, it was awkward and uncomfortable because we didn't communicate before. We didn't have relationships. I had people who worked next to each other and in a school together for 5, 10, or 15 years. They didn't talk about a sports score, let alone, hey, are we doing everything we can to be culturally responsive and sensitive to the world in which our kiddos are living in? That's a tough conversation. That's not usually what you do on a first date.
So you started, Keith, talking about it being the 1-year anniversary of Kobe Bryant's death and his daughter and the other folks on that helicopter, and that was a heavy loss. It's hard to describe in some cases to folks from my generation about Kobe's meaning in the Black community, in the sports community, and in Southern California, but all around the country. But then your kiddos had to deal with a succession of losses. George Floyd's murder. You mentioned Breonna Taylor. You mentioned Ahmaud Arbery, and they're seeing this on the television, violent deaths of Black men in particular and Black women. So I'd love you to talk about, as painful as it is, how that hit your student body, and certainly the African American students, but also all students, regardless of background. How did it hit them? And then I would love you to talk, Keith, about how the work you were doing to confront these issues with staff that you're talking about, you know, how that affected your ability to connect to your students at a time of pain and uncertainty and anxiety, what that looked like, what that actually looked like, and what it would have looked like had you not started this process in the fall of 18, when you started taking on these difficult issues of systemic racism.
Well, here's where my blind spots and my privilege, I think could have been an obstacle, which is why I'm so thankful for, my colleagues and also my friends of color that were able to guide us. By no means did I, as the principal, shoulder this on my own. I could not pretend to understand the pain of a community in which I do not identify. I think that would have been terribly disingenuous. However, I felt very personally responsible and professionally compelled to address the issues. So I started there. So as these things were unfolding, I talked about them with my staff, which broke the glass ceiling of, well, we wouldn't even talk about this before, and especially coming from the principal, if that principal was a white person, or we didn't talk about it in the district because it wasn't something that was allowed to do it. We were allowed to do. So I sent a nightly note to my staff, one email a day. Thank God. The last thing they want to do is hear from me while they're serving kids. And I got into the conversation with them. Again, we're virtual, so it's not like I can go to their room and put my arm around them and talk to one of my students or give a hug to my staff. It was extremely, and I'm an in-person type of guy. I am the worst virtual principal. I fired myself as a virtual teacher of my own children. I am terrible virtually. I feel like my greatest strength is if I can be with you, you have a much better sense of my heart. But to do this virtually, especially in like such a static, non-personal email, I went there because I didn't know any other way to get to them. Especially as we went into the summer and everybody is off contract minus a few of us. So I went there and we talked about murders on national television by police officers and rioting, and what is the difference between protests. And we had kiddos who put together a very, very successful peaceful protest here. We had one that was done in May that unfortunately I could not participate in. I wasn't in town, that our students ran, that was specifically built and executed successfully to address murders of people of color, primarily those in which we mentioned, or not addressing the murder of like Breonna Taylor, which at that time in May was whether it was under investigation or being ignored, however people choose to see that. And then we had a Juneteenth parade, which was very well organized on behalf of our local NAACP, that I did, thank God, have the opportunity to march and participate in. And I finally got to talk to kids, and I finally got to talk to adults about what they were going through. But I felt extremely inept. I felt terribly unsupportive, with the virtual arena we were in, and just the intensity and constant trauma that my friends and colleagues and students were going through, that I really felt like I was doing a terrible job of addressing. However, those that I was able to talk to were thankful that at least I was addressing it, that I wasn't sweeping it under the rug, and thankful that we started this work before we got to this literal state of emergency and trying to figure out what to do, and dealing with the political environment, which stirred the pot. And I also was not bashful about. You can't use the bully pulpit and not expect your countrymen to go after each other. And that was happening on top of it. I mean, it could not have been a worse perfect storm of issues, with a pandemic, an epidemic, and a political storm that was fueling the flames of both issues, both in terms of COVID and in terms of who we are and where we are with our race reckoning. So, we plowed through it together. I would give myself a D- in terms of my work. I would give my staff and my team an A in how they showed up every day and was able to make it through it. I don't know how, especially my colleagues of color, especially those that identify as Black and African American, did it. I don't, and I think I could have done a better job. You know, how do you show humanity through technology? I would love to know that. And how do you do it in a way that is sensitive to all the things that go on? And I think we muddled through. I muddled through, but we could always be better.
You said something so powerful, Keith, a few minutes ago. People came up to you and said, we appreciate you talking about this as principle, because in the past, these issues, ever-present issues of systemic racism and police violence, et cetera, just wouldn't have been talked about. Wouldn't have been talked about between colleagues on your staff, wouldn't have been talked about with students, wouldn't have been talked about from the principal's office, which I guess is understandable, but is pretty scary to think of. Lots of young people going to their school, whether it's virtually or in person, having all this wrenching events going on in their lives and in their communities, and having the school be a place where you don't engage on it. And so, what would you have expected? So kind of a two-part question for you. If that was the norm at Marietta High School, you were going through all these issues of police violence and systemic racism and COVID and loss, and it wasn't talked about at school, what would you expect to have seen in classrooms and from kids? And then, what have you seen in that it is something that there's comfort in being able to raise in classrooms? What does the difference actually look and feel like from the student perspective?
Our goal, in my opinion, as a school, is to provide a safe haven and a sanctuary for students. With that, we provide an academic path to a diploma and an academic skill set, career set, hopefully a servant's heart to prepare our students to learn, earn, and serve when they leave. But if we can't start with safety, and if we can't start with transparency in a conversation, you'll never get to the academic part. You can't force feed that into a child. You can't. So if you don't start with the heart and then kind of migrate up where the blood originates from, you're starting in the wrong spot. So we had to make sure we were prepared, for kind of, as cheesy as it sounds, and I say it all the time, to do the heart work first we're really good at the academic part. You know, I have staff that are brilliant. I am never the smartest person in the room. They know their content all the time. But we have got to work on the other part, you know, the I will part as much as the IQ part, the emotional quotient as much as the intellectual quotient. And we could not have even jumped into this, for as courageous and at times bold or reckless as I am to go out and do something by myself. If I didn't have a superintendent and a board that blessed and supported my courageous blind effort, whatever you want to call it, to dive into this, we never would have been able to do it. If we didn't have a police chief who I met with during the dog days of summer, and thank God he gave me audience when I first showed up, and was willing to listen and understand and come together because they serve our community and in our school, we would have been in places that other schools and other communities were, where all of that hate and all of that frustration and all of that lack of communication would have boiled over in our hallways, in our classrooms, on an athletic field, in a parking lot. It all would have been part of who we are, and we would have been okay with that if we didn't do something about it, because not having a plan and not addressing it is just as bad as coming up with one that fails, if not worse. So to pretend it wasn't going to come to our door and not be part of the fabric in which our country was, and a microcosm of that, would have been extremely ignorant and dangerous. And that goes back to our number one goal and my number one job of providing a place that is safe, providing a place that has a sanctuary for our kids. And if we didn't do that, I can't imagine, minus what we all watched on TV or on our phone, what we would have become. And thank God we did what we did.
And when we talked earlier the other day, Keith, you were mentioning something I thought was important, and that is you could walk into a classroom, sure, in a civics class or government class or social studies class, and hear a discussion of police violence, et cetera. But you could also walk into a math class, to a geometry class, and hear that same discussion. Talk a little bit about that, like what it is you're asking of your teachers, and all of your teachers, not just the ones who kind of naturally are going to deal with current events, but really all of your staff.
Yeah, one of the greatest sins of American public education is forcing a teacher to compartmentalize who they are as a citizen and a human being, with the goal, or quote unquote, in the spirit of academia. I never understood it. Again, as a social studies teacher, as an economics teacher, and a government teacher, I did not have to do that as much because that was built into my standards. But my friends who are science teachers and math teachers and a band teacher and a chorus teacher, you don't leave your humanity like at the door, especially with what we're going through that is a humanitarian crisis, whether it's COVID, whether it's racism, the death that are attached to both, whether it was we were plowing towards an election that turned out to be everything we thought it was going to be: contentious, highly debatable, controversial, completely against precedent and constitutional norms. So are we not going to have our math teacher and science teacher be prepared for that kiddo? Dan just left government class in block 1. Dan's going to math class. Are we going to stuff the Pythagorean theorem down his face? Or are we going to be like, hey, Dan, let's check in, because you either just came from physics or PE or band or wherever, and we expected our teachers to have a conversation. We expected them to check in with the humanity and the heart of our kid before they dove into and went up, the spinal cord to their brain and checked in with them mathematically or scientifically or in the arts. We wanted those other teachers to help carry the burden, the responsibility of addressing all of these issues. Why does it have to be just the social studies teacher? By the way, that doesn't work, because what I know, when I left my civics class in high school and I went to the math class and I said, hey, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, what did you think about, the election? No, we're going to talk about this. And you get shut down. I mean, I thought learning was ubiquitous. I thought all of us were educators. When you go to Home Depot, Dan, and you're on aisle 12, and you ask about a faucet, and you're like, sorry, that's not in my lane. How frustrating is that? And by the way, you're trying to give them your money. Here, with a captive audience, we are responsible for addressing even things outside of our level of mastery. And it could be, I'm going to listen, Dan, but I don't have all the answers. We don't expect the math teacher to be a civic savant. We don't expect the lit teacher, to understand the economic bailout package of, COVID-1, COVID-2, or COVID-3. But we do expect you to be a good listener. And we do expect you to be resourceful. Who can we send you to if we realize you're not in the mind space to understand the Pythagorean theorem, or to dive into the Odyssey today, or to learn, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony? Can we send you to a counselor? Is there somebody in the building immediately we can get you to help you through this? Because we know you're not going to be paying attention in class. And it's not because you're being disrespectful. It's you're just not there yet. So how do we prepare you? So maybe in an hour or maybe tomorrow, you could come back and learn what the world has deemed to be a very important standard in academia. So yeah, we expect that. And the teachers have done a fantastic job of setting aside that 10-4 period. Let's just check in, 10-4, good buddy, I'm with you. Let's talk about it. Let's put up a quote. Let's put up a song, something that's going to naturally, hopefully give a good trigger to a kid, versus triggering them in a way that there is now an outburst in the room that manifests in a way that is deemed to be disrespectful. But it was only because we didn't address who they were before we addressed what we want them to learn.
Yeah. So I'm looking at the clock. I could talk to you all day, but you have a school to run. So, but I got to ask you. So this is the journey you're on, and then we have the election, as you say, totally contentious, controversial, even after the election, and then we have a violent attack on the Capitol on January 6th. And I'm interested, how your staff and teachers and you engage with students on that. But I'm also interested, Keith, I mean, you talked about the diversity of the community. I'm sure families politically are very diverse. There's probably some people who are big supporters of President Trump, former President Trump. They're big supporters of President Biden. These are difficult issues. The attack on the Capitol, for example, difficult issues to talk about without the conversation getting political. And I'm sure you've got the ever-present risk of families coming in and saying, "Hey, we don't want you to talk about that stuff," or "We think the way your teachers are framing the issue is wrong because we have different beliefs at home about this." How did you navigate that? How are you navigating that?
Well, I think the top was blown off it because of the work we did in the summer and the spring, when I also shared with my community that we were going to talk about the race reckoning and part of our society and co-citizens and countrymen dying. Did I get kickback and backlash from that? Absolutely. I was called many things, primarily by white people, whether it was a sellout or whether it was, traitor or you name it. I never really can come to grips with that and how that all went down. I just got over and went past it. We were going to address the election come hell or high water, because I don't understand how you don't do that and say we live in a democratic country where there's a free and appropriate public education, but you're not going to talk about what it directly influences the public via the republic. I don't see the two as separate. Do we need to address it in a sound, appropriate, age appropriate way where we have the resources to address all the things that come from it? Absolutely. Are we going to turn it into a hotbed of just anger and frustration? No, we're going to capture the moment. We're going to meet the moment, and let's address it for what it is. Let's address an election that there is zero evidence about what is going on one side, and then an electoral process, both from the popular vote and an electoral college. Let's look at the science and the history behind all that. Let's understand what that process is going to take. The resilience that we had to show, and our students and our families and our staff, because it never ended. Like, we got through the summer, we're like, okay, we're going to get better. Let's get to higher ground. We get to the election, that goes on for an eternity. Then we have to have a runoff election, and that goes into the wee hours of the night, and that's contested. And obviously it's in Georgia. It's happening right here. We cannot ignore that. That is in our backyard. That is in my students' at least residential state, if not their home state, depending on wherever they're from. And then we get into a full out onslaught attack on the Capitol that has not happened since the War of 1812 from a foreign power. We are going to address all of that goes on. And oh, by the way, people died. It's not that someone just got their feelings hurt or they had a political banner that upset somebody. You attacked the seat of democracy, which ultimately, at the end of the day, allows us to have a free and appropriate education, which allows you to come here regardless of color, creed, who you pray to, who you love. That is protected by that house in which was under attack. So we are going to address these things, but the exhaustion and the resilience needed to get through that, a lot of that we were able to fill our staff's cup through that Friday training, which I can't imagine we would have been able to muddle through it at all without it. So again, I'm super thankful for that, for the staff's willingness to do that.
Well, Keith, I want to thank you for taking time out of your incredibly busy schedule to talk with us this morning. I want to thank you for the work you're doing, and thank your staff and your students and families for the work they're doing. I think a lot of people around the country, a lot of educators around the country are dealing with very similar issues and muddling through the best they can. So it is always helpful to hear from a fellow leader, a fellow practitioner who's grappling with these issues and seeing some success, even though I know you would say there's a long way to go. But thank you so much for all you're doing. Thank you for spending time. Would love to come back to you, later in the spring and see how things are going, and certainly let us know if we can ever be of help to you.
Well, thank you, Dan. I really appreciate the opportunity, and happy to jump on anytime I could be of service.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Passing the Mic. We encourage you to keep the conversation going and share your thoughts with us on social media using the hashtag #PassingTheMic_TNTP. We look forward to connecting with you during our next conversation. Until then, stay safe.